Hello and welcome. My name is Lexi Barrett, and I'm thrilled to be kicking off this podcast series designed to help Virginia's educators better understand policy and effectively tell their stories to policymakers. I'm joined today for the introduction to the series by Gina Keller and Stephanie Krauss. Gina and Stephanie, let's get started by introducing ourselves. So along with who you are and what you do, also tell me about why the work that you do to support Virginia's educators is so important to you. And I'll ask Stephanie to start first.
Thanks, Lexi. My name's Stephanie Krauss. I'm a senior director with JFF, which means I get the distinct pleasure of working with Lexi every day on the national side of the house. And in my role as senior director, I work with states and communities across the country to really help in modernizing what public education needs to be based on how the world is changing, how the workplace is changing, and how that doesn't always match up with what the high school experience is for young people. And so I had the real fortune of beginning to work with Gina, who arguably I now work with just as much as Lexi on the Virginia side of the house. To begin a really tremendous process that you're going to hear about later in the conversation today to modernize what the public education experience can be in Virginia. And so in terms of that work, it has been really satisfying to sort of come back to my roots. My parents met and married in Virginia, and this has been a little bit of a full circle experience. As a mom of two young children, I have often joked that at the end of the experience of modernization, we'll know that it was really successful if I uproot my family from the Midwest where I live now and move into the state. And I'll tell you that I definitely get closer and closer every day and find myself, particularly during pandemic times, looking at real estate options across some of my favorite communities in the Commonwealth.
Thanks, Stephanie. Gina, do you want to go next?
Yes, good morning, and thank you for joining us. Of course, I say good morning. It may be good afternoon for you, so wherever you are, so thank you. I am the director for the Commonwealth Learning Partnership, and with Stephanie's help, I would say we have one of the most fascinating, unique, and life-changing opportunities to modernize education in Virginia. We have, like many states across the nation, have wrestled with what does that K through 12 experience need to look like? And often those conversations start with the high school world, and people are able to grasp that higher, that transition into higher ed, and what does that high school experience look like so that we prepare our young people. What we're doing with the Commonwealth Learning Partnership is looking at all of it, and not all of it so that it's an inch deep, but all of it K through 12 experience as we move into a higher ed post-secondary experiences. What do those opportunities look like? What must exist? And what are we doing together as a collaborative of professional learning organizations, higher ed institutes, and actually willing partners across Virginia to modernize public education in Virginia and truly put what I would call the boots on the ground, really look deeply at the policies, the practices in the classroom pedagogy, etc., all of the things that matter to preparing and upskilling our educators to modernize education. So I'm very, very happy to be here as part of this. Thank you.
That's great. And as I said, my name is Lexi Barrett. I work with Stephanie at JFF. And my role at JFF is leading our federal and state policy work. So I'm based in DC, just across the river from the Commonwealth. And so it's been really exciting for me to engage in this work with Virginia for the past couple of years. One of the things that I really love about this series and about the work that we're hoping to undertake with supporting Virginia's educators is that I'm a lifelong policymaker myself. I worked on Capitol Hill for many years, and I worked in the Obama administration as well. And I really like the part of my job that is helping practitioners and helping people who are doing the real work figure out how to best tell their story to policymakers, because I was often the one on the other side of that table And I've seen really effective advocacy happen. And I also know how policy can seem really far away and opaque and confusing. And anything that I can do and that we can do at JFF to help make that more clear to the people whose voices most need to be heard, I'm really excited about. So thrilled to be a part of this conversation as well as this series. So Gina, you talked a little bit about the Commonwealth Learning Partnership. Stephanie, I wonder if you want to take us back a little bit in history to tell a little bit of the story of how we kind of got to this place with the bringing together of the groups that are part of this partnership and what some of the main goals are, building on what Gina said. You're on mute.
So for those of you who are listening, you should know that while we may be sophisticated around issues of education and policy, we are filming this series on Zoom, and at least for me, I am still learning the platform. So I hope everybody has a little chuckle here at the imperfections that are all of us trying to do this work online. Lexi, I want to speak just for a moment to one of the things that you just said, which is, what is the impetus for this set of videos? So if you're listening to this today, this is the first in a series of different videos that you might be engaging with. And you could even be somebody who engages with us in a couple of months in a skill building workshop. And then I promise I'll quickly pivot over to this question of where have we been and what is the Virginia story over the past few years. But you mentioned it, Lexi, which is you have sat in offices working for elected officials and had a number of folks from the front lines who are passionate about the young people and that they care about their families, their communities, their students come in. And what we know is true is that some of those conversations move you and stick with you and do provoke action, and some don't. And we wanted to be able to cut in. Gina and I both started out in the classroom. We were both counselors and both ran schools and districts, and know that it's exhausting right now and all the time to be an educator. Even more exhausting to be aware of the issues that you feel like you can't change in your classroom or in your school building, and not knowing exactly what to do to facilitate that change. And so the impetus for this session was really to cut through all of the theory behind what is policy making and what is advocacy, and really just figure out what are some of the life hacks. You are in the classroom today. It is a COVID context. Things are tougher than they've ever been. Stress is higher than it's ever been. There are some days where you literally feel like your life is on the line and your kids' lives are on the line. And you see an issue that needs to change. Do you have very specific tips and tricks and know-how of which level of government you need to go to and what you do once you get there? And that is the hope behind this series. And it really patterns itself, I think, off of the history of the last 5 years. So about 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to step in and begin working with all of you in the Commonwealth around a campaign that would eventually become known as Virginia is for Learners. At the time, it was really a response to a couple of different things. This was at the time when Terry McAuliffe was still governor, and a part of his campaign, and you can actually learn more about this if you go on the Commonwealth Learning Partnership's website. There's a white paper you can download called The Virginia Story, and that's just www.commonwealthlearningpartnership.com. It's right on the front page. But what happened when McAuliffe became governor, and some of you will remember this from the time, is that Virginia students were being really over-tested, and it was taking over the high school experience, and it was having legitimate health and mental health consequences for students and for educators, and dimming the vibrance of the educational experience. And as one colleague said, there was a sense that the state that was always known for setting the bar for what a quality education looked like had unintentionally started to graduate a number of test takers instead of thinkers and doers. And there was a need for a course correction. And so McAuliffe and his staff did a learning tour. So what's important to hear right now is that learning tour was apolitical. It was a number of folks from the Department of Education and the governor's office together who just really wanted to understand what things were looking like and their bias around this idea of kids being really over-tested, and the education experience being compromised as a result was confirmed across community after community, from Southwest Virginia all the way to Northern Virginia, to the heart of the state in Richmond and throughout. And that kicked off a wave of innovation grants, and it kicked off a wave of significant leadership galvanizing, predominantly with superintendents and division leadership. And what we saw was this kind of rise across the state of community level leaders who were saying, you know what, we can actually innovate. And when Gina and I talk about modernizing, really what we mean is what our friend in Roanoke, Virginia, Superintendent Alan Siebert talks about, where you look at where our kind of version of education comes from, and it comes from trying to get farm kids into factories. And those roots are still really prevalent. And those farm kids were mostly white. And you have a very different face in Virginia, racially, ethnically, but also family experience and need-wise. Things like what Alan would say is things like surgery have changed tremendously. You wouldn't want the surgical instruments of the early 20th century, and yet we settle for the educational instruments of the early 20th century. And so Virginia's for Learners was the formation of both the coalition of those leaders and more, an invitation for more folks to join, and also a campaign, a call to action to say, you know what, we more than any other state might actually be positioned to really turn this around and really update what the educational experience would be. That has gone on for a couple of years. I'm going to pass over to Gina here in about 15 seconds because she can really speak to the development of some profiles that were really core to this work. But one of the things, Lexi, that you and I talked about a lot was, and you'll have to, if you're listening, you'll have to excuse me. I was an elementary school teacher, and so I always alliterate. But we talked about sort of the P's of change, not like my kids, not the pee-pee dance, but the different P's of change in Virginia, that at once there was kind of this cosmic spark for change that happened, where you had practitioners who were skilled and who were credible, who were plugged in statewide and locally, who were pushing to change practice, what actually happened in school, what standards mattered, getting rid of some tests, pushing for performance-based tests and better work-based learning and better and more deep learning in the classroom. And then some policy changes, everything from the innovation grants to actually a reduction of some of those standardized tests, the adoption of the profile you'll hear about probably from Gina. And then the public will piece. People were excited to be a part of a movement, to be a part of what was happening in their state. I'm always impressed by how much people love being from Virginia, that the idea that they would be in the lead for this really meant something. So that perception, policy, and practice change became then the spark for a body that Gina now runs, the Commonwealth Learning Partnership. So this campaign that Virginia is for learners became a promise. And then the education organization stepped up and said, we're going to make sure that this promise is actualized. And that's been sort of the latest phase of the work.
Thanks, Stephanie. Gina, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I was really fortunate to work more closely with Stephanie as I was the assistant superintendent for learning at the Department of Education. And as we worked together, what I recognized, and especially I would say being at the Department of Education, which operates very differently And then when I was a superintendent of schools, where things could happen quickly and things could happen certainly following protocol and processes. But the point being that what I recognized from Stephanie and the work that that she'd been able to do across the nation to really help people look deeply and think about the actions that had to take place to change education. I mean, to really change and not just to speak about it, but to put systems in place. And she uses the word promises. The Virginia is for Learners campaign, that movement was and continues to be something that people are energized by. They're energized, they feel, I think there's some hope, attached to that particular movement. So as I worked from the Department of Education with Stephanie, I was able to really work closely with William and Mary, George Mason University, our professional learning organizations like the Virginia Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, the Virginia Association of School Superintendents, School University Resource Network, and Virginia School Consortium for Learning. Those are all, I was going to use acronyms, but I try to stay away from all those. But those teams of people and higher ed entities came together with a key question to start the conversation. So we had a profile of a Virginia graduate that was required. In November of 2017, the Board of Education adopted that. It's in state code. It's required in Virginia. These are the the 5 C's. Some places have 6 C's, the competencies and skill sets that must be in place for our students to thrive in an ever-changing world. And again, a K through 12 focus, not just high school. So all of those pieces, the innovation grants and the conversations really were, I would say, the on-ramp to bigger and deeper work. And so I worked really closely with those teams from those partner organizations to look at what are the things that we need to have happen. We have this profile of a Virginia graduate, and there's a lot of head nodding and a lot of interest in, yes, that makes sense. Those are the skills we need. They're not even soft skills. They are the skills. They are the competencies. And so how are we going to do that? Well, we knew that lots of realms of our world had to change. Higher ed preparation. Our educators themselves had to really step back and look at how they were trained. Quite often, we realized that educators sometimes had to unlearn what they had learned because it's just a new and different world and expectation. So together, that group created Profile of a Virginia Educator, and the key lead for that was George Mason University. A Profile of a Virginia Classroom, the key lead was Virginia Association for Supervision Curriculum Development. And all of these people connected to work together on these. And then the Profile of an Education Leader. And the key lead was William and Mary. And they gathered stakeholders for over 18 months, almost 2 years, to speak to what has to change in order for us to actualize this profile of the graduate, because we can't keep doing the same thing. And that was also a nice on-ramp to the creation of the Commonwealth Learning Partnership. And I really do believe the best way to frame that work is that we're here to deliver on the promise. We promised we were going to do this. This is for our children, our families, our communities. So let's make this happen. And it is messy, exciting, important work.
And Lexi, just quickly to sort of summarize, understanding that there are probably a number of different people who are tuning into this video, some who are folks on the front lines in, teachers in classrooms, others who are superintendents, and some who may be working for the state. I think the way that Gina and I view the sort of pulse of this story is that Virginia is home to some of the best educators, you might argue the best educators in the country, who have been attempting to innovate in a system that wasn't designed for it for a number of years, with some success, but not optimal success. And what started 5 years ago was a recognition of over-testing. But when that was taken away, what was left was a recognition that even if the testing is removed, if what the experiences are don't prepare young people for a changing world, it's still not sufficient. And that was that call for change. Virginia is for learners. That eventually became embedded as the new brand under strong leadership from Superintendent Lane at the Department of Education. So Virginia is for Learners still lives, but now it lives as the fundamental architecture for what learning needs to look like and what the state stands for, that they need a more modern and student-centered, equitable experience for young people in the state. And then the offshoot work that Gina leads, and for people who are listening and want to understand sort of where and how these pieces fit, was that teachers, it's really about you, and school leaders, it's really about you, that if the experiences of young people have to change, if that profile of what a high schooler or a middle schooler experiences and what they need by the time they graduate is changing, then we have to change how we do pre-service and in-service. You need the training and skills and supports, and I would argue also the compensation, to be able to be in this work and to do what you need to do. And that really is that accountability, deliver on the promise piece.
I'm really struck as you both kind of take us back in time, how far away a lot of that seems now. Stephanie, you talked about the pandemic moment a little earlier, and it definitely does feel like we're in a very different place than we were, but certainly that a lot of these things that you all are talking about as being the fundamental pillars of Virginia's for Learners and forming the work of the Commonwealth Learning Partnership are really more critical than ever. But we also know that educators are starting the school year, no matter what, in a very different way than they had ever imagined that they would be. And Stephanie, I'm thinking back as we were grappling, as the pandemic was kind of coming into place in March and our lives were changing, we knew that we wanted to do something with educators this year, right? We wanted to do something around policy. We wanted to do something on advocacy, because that has always been a pillar of the work that we've been doing in partnership with the Commonwealth. And we decided that that felt more important than ever. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why bringing policy, bringing educators kind of firmly into this conversation together, and doing it in this way, right? We originally envisioned a very large event with lots of people. It would have been lovely, but we're doing it this way. And I think in some ways it's actually more exciting. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about why this moment feels really important for this series.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like an LBC, life before COVID, LAC, life after COVID moment. You know, I think to answer your question, Lexi, I have to go back to the fact that, like, I'm an educator, I'm a mom, I'm grappling with these issues myself in my home. Right now, I've got a number of friends who are teachers, who are school leaders, who are district leaders, and cannot imagine what it would feel like, to be honest, if I was still in the classroom right now, or if I was still running a school right now, particularly while also having to contend with caring for aging parents and taking care of my own children and the complexity of this moment. I come out of both an education world and a youth development world, and there's a phrase that's used all of the time in youth development when you talk about making decisions about young people. And the phrase is, no decision about us without us. And I would say that, like, in this moment, the same is true. I think that you have a series of decisions or non-decisions being made at every level, and everyone is looking to the next person to offer clarity, and there isn't any. And one of the things that has been really striking, Gina and I have seen it in a couple of the partnerships conversations, is that the stress, strain, and fear and worry that a classroom teacher is experiencing is mirroring what a superintendent is experiencing. And yet the intensity of the number of decisions that have to be made and how much is happening and how fast, that there isn't good communication always happening between the two. And so the teacher is waiting for the superintendent, and the superintendent is waiting for the state, and the state is waiting for the US Department of Education, or for the elected officials or the public health officials. And so this is honestly a part of like giving the folks who are listening to this video a chance to take their power back and to have some agency over their own lives and their own communities and their own jobs and their own classrooms and students, and to know what to do. Because, you know, for those of you who are listening on the call, we who are not in the classroom in the school building anymore, whether that is in person or remote, do not know intimately how these policy decisions are playing out in real time and affecting your really very real, very valuable lives. And so for us, in that moment, we saw an opportunity to first acknowledge that there are great groups who have policy and advocacy committees who are coming up with agendas, whether it's associations or membership organizations or others, and that there is still power in the individual and the individual's experience, and that the equipping sort of at scale for folks to know, should they choose, how to tell their story, where to tell it, and what makes it effective, was a critical asset to have in the arsenal. And, you know, here's the deal. Like, let me just say this, and then I'll pass it back to you. Teachers should not have to be trained advocates, and teachers need to be trained advocates right now. School leaders should not have to be trained advocates, and school leaders need to be trained advocates right now. You know, anybody listening to this video, you are uniquely well positioned to make the kind of change that's going to not only save kids' lives, but set them up for success, to take care of your colleagues and the families in your communities. And for all of us in the policy space, we don't know if we don't know. And we don't know what we don't know. And we need you to be able to tell your stories. And for us, I think fundamentally, it's about how do we make that less exhausting to even think about doing, and equip you to take those actions should you choose to.
Thanks, Stephanie. Gina, what do you hope that an educator, whether they're a classroom teacher, whether they're a principal, superintendent, who's listening to this series, will take away from it?
My hope is that they will see that they are not alone in their desire to see change. They're not, and often we find when people are wanting to advocate, whether it's in front of the local school board or to a state, an elected state official, they can quite often feel really alone, or alone even in the position that they are taking, because it's so personal to them and has implications for them personally. But what we find through the years of work that I've done, but also as we interviewed and were able to really talk to those who have experiences and insights about just advice, for lack of a better way to say it, not what to advocate for, but how to advocate, is that there was almost a little bit of a relief that, okay, this makes sense and I can do this. And I think what Stephanie said is so beautifully said, that we must together, educators, leaders in education, we must take this opportunity, this moment in time, and for many, many years, not just for now. It's not a one shot at advocating for what we want our schools to be and what we need and must have them be for all children. But this moment in time and this opportunity together, I believe, helps people see that, again, they're not alone. There are appropriate ways to advocate where the emotion doesn't distract from the message that you want to relay, and that there are many, and I would say the majority of educators across our Commonwealth who really see that this is an opportunity to be in it together. And I believe that they'll see that these things are doable. They're doable.
That's great. So just to give folks who are listening a sense of the sessions that are coming up, and we hope that you will listen to the whole series, but you should also feel free to kind of jump in on the ones that grab you the most. So we wanted to make sure that everyone listening got a good sense of these different levels of policy that Stephanie was referring to. So we're going to have a session focused on federal policy so that you can understand what are the decisions that are affecting your classroom, affecting your school, that are happening at the federal level, and how do you think about getting engaged in those conversations. We're going to have a similar one about state policy, really diving in with some experts who have been deeply involved in Virginia state policy for a long time. And then we're going to have one on local and district policy too, because I do think that is one of the issues that can be the most intimidating, is just sorting, I know I have a problem. I know that someone above me needs to fix it, but who is that person, right? So helping to distinguish, when do I go to my district? When do I go to my city? When do I go to my state? When do I go to the federal government? Can be, I agree with both of you, really empowering for those listening. And then we're also having sessions one on equity and racial justice, and we're going to have a session on community organizing as well. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about those two, just to give a little flavor of what folks can expect.
I do, and I was going to hop in, so I'm so glad you invited that, Lexi. You know, one thing we didn't talk about, because we were just kind of going back on the brass tacks of the architecture of Virginia's for Learners and the partnership, and why this series is that the companion to being an advocate and being an ally is recognizing the level to which there is anti-Blackness on display, that there is racial unrest and continued exclusionary practice and discrimination that has meant that in this moment and every moment, in an outdated education system, young people of color are being hard hit and most held back. And that it is systemic, and that it is persistent, and that it is way more inflamed than many of us even realize. Back to what I said about no decision about us without us, and teachers knowing the intimacy of the experience. We know that people of color are suffering in a number of very specific and harmful ways right now. And we've seen how that has been incited, but also a measure of hope and optimism through the uprisings that have happened across the country, including in Virginia. And the need for the education community that a part of modernization has to be a fundamental commitment to being anti-racist. That if you care about kids, you care about being anti-racist because you care about kids having the right opportunities and supports, and feeling included and loved, and knowing that they belong in any learning environment. And so we wanted to make sure that in addition to skill building and understanding the policy-making process, there was also an opportunity to really understand what education justice is and what racial justice looks like in the context of the education system. Those two conversations are meant to be either starters or supplemental. They are by no means sufficient for the kind of work we all need to be doing to really dig in deep into issues of racism and how they play out in our schools and learning environments. But we would encourage you to include them in the fuller suite of things and conversations that you're having to really take that on. So, you know, as we conclude, I would just really implore you that when you think about a more modern education system, that you're moving from one that's about white farm kids being prepared for factories for every kid in the Commonwealth to be prepared for the future. And that means getting rid of anything that is going to exclude a kid, hold them back, or harm them, and replacing it with really healing and helpful measures that give not only the kids, but the educators the supports that they need.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. So I'm really grateful for you both for joining us today, and I'm excited about the series. I hope that everyone listening really enjoys it. I hope that if you want to follow up and you're interested in talking more, that you find us on Twitter or on our websites or the Commonwealth Learning Partnership webpage. And we're excited to support Virginia's educators in this way and hope that you all will find it useful. So thank you, Gina. Thank you, Stephanie. This was a really great conversation.
Thanks, Lexi, so much.
Thank you. Thank you.